Good afternoon, advocates. Thank you for joining us today. This is our 8th episode of our Alzheimer's Advocacy Academy, and today's episode will cover state and federal budgeting cycle and the appropriations process. I am Nicole Dalsky, your Government Affairs Manager for California, and today we're being joined by advocates from across 4 states, including Arizona, California, Hawaii, and Nevada. We have ambassadors, ACT members, and Alzheimer's state champions, and we're so grateful for your time and hope that you find today's episode helpful and engaging. Just one quick housekeeping item. Throughout today's presentation, we will pause for Q&A. Please reference the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen to enter any questions that you have throughout today's presentation. I will now pass it over to today's presenter, Public Policy and Advocacy Manager for the California Orange County chapter, Daniel Gaetan. Welcome, Daniel.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today on this fun topic of appropriations. As you can see, I put gel on my hair for only the 2nd time in quarantine, so this goes to show how much I value all of you. So thank you for being here. So in my presentation, I'm going to talk about federal appropriations. I'm going to give you a basic overview of the process and how it should work and how it actually works. A little bit about the timeline and some of the terminology that goes with it as well. So let's get started here. So the annual budget cycle in the federal government, it happens every single year, and it kicks off on the first Monday of February. The president submits his budget proposal to Congress for the following fiscal year. So, and that fiscal year obviously starts in October. Now, the president's budget is not necessarily seen as a starting point for the federal budget. Instead, it's seen more symbolic as to show the priorities of the president. Congress has the explicit authority to actually appropriate funds for the federal government. So they receive the president's budget and continue on with their normal process. And even if it's, majority party from the same party of the president, they still kind of do their own thing. So it is what it is. In response to the president's budget, Congress sets a budget resolution. And that usually happens April 15th, although that's not necessarily a hard deadline. And the budget resolution pretty much sets the spending caps for the upcoming fiscal year. It's something that must be passed by both chambers, but it doesn't become law. It doesn't go to the president's desk. It is something that both chambers use as a guide for setting their budget for the next fiscal year. So once they set that spending cap, then the appropriations committees and subcommittees, divvy that up appropriately and have a goalpost to work towards. And thereafter, in the spring and summer months, the committees work on the bills. Usually by May or June, the committees start to report the bills out for floor considerations and all of that process to continue. As I mentioned, October 1st is the start of the new federal fiscal year. So that is a deadline for all appropriations measures to be enacted. And if these regular bills, which we'll talk about in a minute, are not enacted by the beginning of the fiscal year, Congress must adopt a continuing resolution, or CR, as I'm sure you've heard before, to continue funding for the federal government in order to avoid partial or full government shutdown. And we'll talk more about continuing resolutions a bit later. So in this next slide here, I put for you all our the appropriations subcommittees. So in the House and the Senate appropriations committees, there are 12 subcommittees, and they are here listed on the left-hand side. And I apologize if there's a lag. Some of you may or may not be on this slide yet, but be patient. So these subcommittees are each responsible for reporting out an appropriations bill that funds a certain part of the government. As you can see here on the right-hand column, these are all the federal agencies that these subcommittees oversee. So you can see here, Commerce, Justice, Science, and related agencies. They oversee the Department of Commerce, Department of Justice, NASA, NSF, and other agencies. I highlighted here in purple, accordingly, our Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education and Related Agencies subcommittee, because that is the one that our requests fall mostly into. Things from our Alzheimer's research funding that we request pretty much every year, to vote infrastructure Alzheimer's funding, which we've been advocating for the last couple of years. So majority our issues, funding issues, fall into this subcommittee. However, in the future, we may be in other subcommittees. A good example is actually we're currently advocating for the elder justice abuse program for the language with regards to Alzheimer's. So we're advocating for that piece of legislation to be enacted. If it is enacted and if it requires funding in the future, that probably won't be through the Labor HHS committee. It probably will be through the Commerce, Justice, and Science subcommittee, since the Department of Justice falls under that appropriations subcommittee. So, for our purposes, Labor HHS is very important currently, but that may continue to be the case, but we may also branch out into other subcommittees in the future. Something that's important, I think, to distinguish between is authorization and appropriation measures. Authorization measures establish, continue, or modify different programs. So that may be for 1 year, multi-year, or that may be permanent. So that authorizes something into law. And once something is authorized into law, it can then be appropriated. There's not necessarily any appropriations that are attached to the authorization measures. And a perfect example of that is the Vote Infrastructure for Alzheimer's Act. As you remember, a couple of years ago, we were advocating for this piece of legislation to be enacted into law. And we did that in just 13 months, which is amazing. So we advocated for that and it became law. However, when it was implemented, there was no funding attached to it. So we had to go back and we had to into the appropriations process and get money appropriated for that authorized measure. And that just goes to show the symbiotic relationship between the two. And with regards to appropriations measures, there are 3 different types. Regular appropriations bills, which are the 12 that I talked about, continuing resolutions, which we'll talk about in a minute, and supplemental appropriations as well. And one thing I failed to mention is the 12 appropriations bills that each subcommittee must pass. Well, that happens in each chamber, in the Senate and the House, and they must go through process. They must be negotiated. They must be, well, I'm not going to say must, but there should go through a hearing process. They should be able to offer amendments by any member on the House and Senate floor. And when those measures pass each respective chamber, then both chambers conference and produce one bill for each of those committees that then goes through all of Congress to the president's desk. And that's how the government is supposed to work. Now, we'll get into in a minute how that doesn't always happen, how it's supposed to work. But that whole process is what we call regular order. So, Congress strives to achieve regular order, but it is much more easier said than done. Another thing to understand is mandatory versus discretionary spending. And here we're getting into the fun part now. So mandatory spending, primary payments on benefit programs, which laws set eligibility rules and benefit formulas. So these are things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These programs are set by formula and set by law. So these are not the things that is negotiated every single year in Congress, not necessarily at least. Discretionary spending is really what lawmakers spend their time and negotiation, and that's where all the fights happen, right? And that's what we advocate for mostly, discretionary spending. Obviously, Medicare and Medicaid, are things that we also would advocate for if there was huge cuts to it. But generally speaking, on a year-to-year basis, discretionary spending is what lawmakers are negotiating. And I put on here, earmarks are no more. So if you're not familiar with earmarks, there was a time in Congress for decades and decades actually, where members of Congress can actually earmark certain funds for projects that are in their district. And this was very much common practice throughout the years. However, in the late, early 2000s, this practice was starting to be abused a bit. There was some corruption involved, and thus Congress decided to go away with earmarks altogether in 2011 with the passage of the Budget Control Act of 2011, which took a lot of measures to really reduce spending in the federal government. And I think this image is perfect because, when it was your congressman, he was bringing home the bacon, but when the other congressman did it, it was seen as an evil act. So no more earmarks, although you can make an argument that they still exist in some form, but much different than they used to be. So just to give you all a sense of the size of the federal budget, we're going to take a quick look here at the fiscal year 2019 budget, which, as you can see, federal government brought in $3.5 trillion in revenue, and they spent $4.4 trillion. So there was a cool $1.1 trillion deficit, no big deal. And you can see here within the spending, there's mandatory and discretionary spending that we talked about. Mandatory spending accounts for about 2/3 of all spending. And if we see here in the mandatory spending category, that's broken down a little bit further. Medicare, Medicaid, I apologize if it's a little bit small, but Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, things like SSI, unemployment, child income tax credits, things like that, SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Some of these are the mandatory spending programs that the federal government spends on. And then the discretionary spending is broken down. So we have, it's interesting because more than half of all discretionary spending goes to defense, and you can see that there, at least in 2019. And a little bit less than half goes to everything else. So everything from education, transportation, VA benefits, health, justice, international affairs, and everything else goes into that other half. So in relation to the overall federal spending, the discretionary part is a small part of it, but that's what Congress really focuses the most attention and effort on. That's what you hear really make the news more than anything. So continuing resolutions, CRs, as I mentioned, if Congress doesn't have all 12 spending bills through the chamber and to the president by October 1, they must pass a continuing resolution. Now, they can pass a continuing resolution for one of the spending bills, for two of the spending bills, or for all of them, depending on the type of progress they made throughout the year. And typically, when they do that, the CR is set at existing appropriations for the previous year. So it's literally a way of kicking the can down the road. And it's unfortunate for agencies and people who rely on these new fiscal year appropriations because everything has to be on hold. They can't start new projects. They can't fund new things. In our sense, for Alzheimer's research, when researchers are trying to apply for the next year's funding for Alzheimer's research, well, they can apply for that if there's a CR, because that means the NIH hasn't received funding, the new funding from Congress, continue their activities. So that is unfortunate, and it's not really a great way of governing. Unfortunately, it's happened. It is more than a new norm in Congress. So as you see here, only 4 instances since 1977 were all regular appropriations bills enacted by the start of the fiscal year. We came close, actually, in fiscal year 2019. Congress passed 10 of the 12 appropriations bills by October 1st, and there were 2 holdouts. And unfortunately, those 2 holdouts there were some significant disagreements with the president and Congress, which led to the longest government shutdown in congressional history of 35 days and shuttered 9 different federal agencies. So it's just kind of a way it works now. For better or worse, it is what it is. And as you can see, it's the fastest way out of town when people can't make agreements on these federal appropriations bills. So I thought the image was very appropriate. Omnibus appropriations. So once you get into a CR, regular order kind of goes out the window. and things. The main goal is ensuring that a long-term funding package is established for the remainder of the fiscal year. So Congress is no longer going to spend the time to introduce individual appropriations bills, debate them, offer amendments, and doing all of that as they would do in regular order. So instead, what happens is all of the 12 or 10 or 9 or however remaining appropriations bills are outstanding, they get consolidated into an omnibus bill. And you can see these omnibus bills are huge, thousands of pages, gigantic. There's a lot of provisions in them, and theoretically, if the process was done right, those individual appropriations bills would have had hearings and would have had some type of debate in committee, months before. But that's not always the case. And as you can see here, it's an efficient way of resolving differences, because when you have a bill that huge, it's all or nothing. And if there are voices on either side of it that are against certain measures, well, it's kind of tough luck, because you either fund the government or not, and move on. So omnibus appropriations are something that has also become a norm in Congress. Lastly, I want to touch on something is the supplemental appropriations. And supplemental appropriations are enacted in cases where, as you can see here, resources provided through the annual appropriations process are determined to be inadequate or not timely. So things like emergencies. And right now is a perfect example of supplemental appropriations. Congress has passed four supplemental appropriations to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. But they also have done that for, hurricanes, other natural disasters, fires, things like that. So it just kind of is a response of Congress to ensure that the needs of the country or a certain part of the country are being met during times of an emergency. And these can happen as standalone bills, but they can also be added to the normal appropriations process if there's something really dramatic happening that happens to coincide with the normal appropriations timeline. So I hope this all provides a little bit better understanding to how this process works. And we're really fortunate today to actually have a really special guest, a dear friend of mine. Many of you know I used to work on Capitol Hill, and Courtney Cuevas was one of my colleagues back then. And we're fortunate to have her on the line here with us today to talk a little bit about this process, how it looks from the inside, both in normal times and during a global pandemic. So, Courtney, go ahead.
Hi, Daniel. Hi, everyone. I see some familiar names in the attendee list. I used to work for Congressman Jared Huffman of Northern California up until last year. So, met with a lot of the Alzheimer's advocates during my time with his office. So I've been on the Hill for 6 different appropriation cycles, both in the minority and now in the majority. So I think it'll be helpful if I can hopefully share with you some sort of inside baseball tactics so you can better approach your meetings with other Hill staffers. So really, I think one of the most important things to understand is that there's going to be 435 different member priorities and differences in how each office approaches their appropriations. So, in general, the member staff are going to be wading through dozens of requests for each staffer, totaling probably over 100 for their boss. And those are just the requests that are going to make it in for the members' priorities. And we have countless others that don't actually make it in. So when you have your meetings, you're likely going to meet with a staffer that covers healthcare, but that's going to be just one of their issues. So for example, in my current office, I work on defense requests to NASA funding, to environmental protections, and a host of other issues in between. So when we're meeting with advocates like you, we get requests, and we have to also prioritize these requests based on the members' interests, and that can be from their personal interests, or maybe it's a district need or another political goal. So, for example, my current boss is a member of Northern Virginia, and her priorities are likely going to be different from someone who's in Southern California or Texas, or a different state just with different needs. So within each of our issue areas in our office, we're going to be competing for the members' priority. Also, if those issues fall underneath the same bill. So Daniel mentioned the labor HHS bill, which is the beast of all bills separate from defense. And this is where all of the healthcare research funding priorities are, as you guys mostly know. But then there are also a number of other important things like gun violence research or workforce labor development issues or Title IX family planning or rural healthcare, just, a whole slew of things related to healthcare, education, and labor. So within the healthcare research requests, you guys may notice that some members will sign on to 24 different health research requests, and they like to focus as broadly as they can with, whether it's Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or just, down the list of all the different diseases that could have research funding. But then you may also see that there's a member you're meeting with who may just only want to focus on one letter, and that could be the NIH funding, and that's the increase to NIH as their overall priority. And so you guys might start to see that this is where you have offices that you may have champion members who will include Alzheimer's research as their overall funding priority, or you have a member who may just say, I'm putting all my eggs in the NIH basket, and that's what we want to, focus our priorities on. So, being in the priority is not necessarily a be-all, end-all for members, because we also get to rank down the line through, over 100 different requests. And then we also will use the requests that we sign on to do, different press advocacy, and it's not necessarily just advocating with the Appropriations Committee, but we can use groups like you guys to help get a groundswell of support for something by signing on to a letter. So that's just a quick overview of how we will handle appropriations in a member office. But Daniel mentioned CRs and omnibus packages, and from our perspective, CRs and stopgap legislation are not ideal. He did a great job of talking about how research in particular is impacted when we go into shutdowns or CRs, and like we saw with the 35-day shutdown last year, we had countless number of federal grant proposals that were just left on the table that couldn't get funded because whether they were in the middle of that funding application cycle and everything just got shelved, or folks couldn't plan accordingly. So, there's a potential cure for Alzheimer's that could have been left on a stack that didn't get funded. And then also, with the CR, as he mentioned, the agencies can't plan further than, a couple months out with that because they're not able to see what funding they're going to get for the rest of the year. So whether it's staffing up or putting funding to new programs, they're not able to really devote the resources to that. And so what we see is we just see kind of the status quo and things don't really get advanced as much as we'd like them to. So as much as possible, we support having regular appropriations bills passed. And just to kind of wrap up quickly, the appropriations requests are a very public way for our bosses to show that they are supporting something specific. But it's important for the Hill staffers to hear directly from you guys about what that local or the state impact of the federal dollars is. Because as I mentioned, this, a staffer you're meeting with may be covering 5 or 6 different issues, and they also maybe healthcare might not be their number one issue that they're covering for their boss, or maybe it's new to them. And so, it's important that you guys approach these meetings. Just assume who you're talking to doesn't know, everything about Alzheimer's research, and that you guys, and I know from experience, you guys do a really fantastic job of teaching us in our meetings about what it is, why you're here, why you're on the Hill, and why you're advocating. So, anything that you can do, whether it's sharing relevant research that's happening at universities near you or in your state, or discussing statistics about an aging population in the members district. That was something that was really important for my last boss, Mr. Huffman, because we had a large aging population in his district in Northern California. So, supporting Alzheimer's research just to help the constituents directly that way was one of our priorities. So just really making sure that you're bringing that local impact to the staffers, then you're going to be more likely to break through with your requests and getting into those priorities.
Sounds good. Thank you, Courtney. I want to open it up for questions at this point real quickly before we move on to the next part to let Courtney get back to her job and leading our effort here with COVID-19. I want to start off, Nicole, if you could find any questions, but I want to start off with a quick question for Courtney. How has the job changed now being in a pandemic? We're kind of in the middle of the appropriations process. And how do you see that has changed?
Yeah, so the first week we went on telework was right in the middle of our offices putting in our appropriations requests. And so what goes into that is each individual office, as I mentioned, we're sorting, these hundreds of priorities, and we actually have to upload all of our requests into a system. So that was difficult. So we all were teleworking on our laptops for the very first time. So the appropriations deadlines all slid back just to accommodate extra time for us. And as far as I know, the committees are working behind the scenes right now still as they normally would. We had a couple weeks of limbo because we all had to figure out how we can transition to doing markups digitally. And some of you may have seen in the news that we passed a resolution last week to allow members to vote remotely, and then we've also been able to pass a new rule that we could use digital meetings like this to be able to have markups, which normally members have to be there in person for. So we're working through those things, but knock on wood, we are able to get our bills out and voted on, and we'll be coming to the floor. I think the other biggest difference is we're not getting face-to-face time with advocates who are doing the flyouts into Washington. So I've had a number of calls, and I know my boss is just today on a number of calls with a lot of the healthcare groups. So we're seeing a transition to doing them virtually, which has worked well for some members if they're tech savvy, and maybe jury's still out on some of the other guys.
All right. Thanks for that insight. Did you find any other questions, Nicole?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. No questions came in. Many advocates expressed gratitude for Courtney joining today. So we just wanted to express that to you, Courtney. Thank you for your time and for sharing some helpful information.
Yeah, absolutely.
But no questions at this time, Daniel.
Cool. Well, sounds good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Courtney, for spending some time of your day to join us. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. So we're going to move on now to state appropriations, and I want to introduce my colleague, Jared DiRusso from our Sacramento Policy Office. So go ahead, Jared.
Hi, Daniel. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Jared DiRusso. I'm California's Government Affairs Director, and I'll be doing a quick overview of the state budget process, and with an overview, hopefully, that helps in all 4 states that we have volunteers from today. And then I'll be introducing one of our advocates to speak a little bit about budget advocacy and her experiences. On the previous slide, it said that state budgets are a statement of values, and that's a phrase that we hear a lot from budget professionals and political leaders at all. This is in California. Last year, we were able to secure $5 million from our state budget process for the Healthy Brain Initiative. And this is an interesting example of what this looks like, because the Healthy Brain Initiative is something that was developed at the national level with our National Policy Office and the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But to see it implemented here in California, we needed state funding to do so. And so last year, because of the advocacy of many of you on this call, we were able to get $5 million directly to counties to be able to advance some of these priorities. On the current slide, you'll see the state capitals for Hawaii, California, Nevada, and Arizona. And so again, I'll be doing a broad overview that hopefully will apply for all 4 states. And obviously there are some massive issues that are similar. I would note, if you do have state-specific questions after the presentation, please feel free to reach out to your professionals in each of our states. For California, it would be myself in our state policy office. In Hawaii, it would be Ian Ross, and in Nevada and Arizona, it would be James Fitzpatrick. Next slide, Daniel. So while it is similar between the federal and state budget processes that we're always looking for new spending as an association on an issue, a key difference between the federal government and states, and a similarity between our 4 states, is that all state budgets must be balanced, as opposed to the federal government that can run the revenues must meet or exceed spending, and that is where many of the budget battles occur, is to balance a state budget. Key difference between 2 of our states and 2 other states are that Arizona and California have annual budget processes, whereas Nevada and Hawaii have 2-year budget cycles. And while their budget cycles are 2 years, so a budget will be passed that will apply for 2 fiscal years, there is still a lot that can be done each year in both of these states, just like in Arizona and California, to advance and protect budget priorities. A really quick note, all of these fiscal years begin July 1. In California, our legislators are required to pass a budget by June 15th. They will forego their salaries and payment. And this was due to California historically, about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, not passing budgets on time, to the point that the voters passed a ballot measure creating this policy where legislators no longer get paid. And ever since then, miraculously, our state has passed budgets on time. Next slide. This will just give you a sense of the size of the operating budgets for the states. Some of these numbers may seem familiar and some may be different, even for the kind of the most expert of you. These focus on operating budgets, and states have budgets that are somewhat larger than those operating budgets if you were to look at it and to include the ones that we focus on in our advocacy. The operating budget will fund programs and cut programs, and these will be the budgets that we're typically focused on each year. Next slide. And states fund, a similarity between our 4 states is that the things that are funded are fairly similar across the board. There is a slight mistake on this slide. Education, public schools, college system, they're all kind of the same thing. What was meant to be placed here is K through 12 and public higher education. These are typically the largest pools of spending that each state will contribute to. For us, obviously, the Health and Human Services budget is the one that we're typically focused on when it comes to programs. To note, many of these programs, while they are passed by a state legislature and they are funded by the state budget, that they also do receive federal funds. Medicaid and the health budget is a good example of this. That is typically a state and federal partnership that combines funds from both the federal government and the state government to fund that program. Moving on to the next slide, please. Well, we're now starting to understand had our governor present the first post-COVID-19, I don't know if you would say post-COVID-19, but first COVID-19 related state budget. And in it, we saw it's our state, California state's first attempt to balance a $54 billion budget. And this means massive cuts to programs that we care deeply about: in-home supportive services, community-based adult services, caregiver resources, all of these programs are right now slated to be cut. In Arizona, Hawaii, and Nevada, it's unclear at this point. I've seen some proposals of how the states plan to balance these budgets: rainy day funds, cuts to state employees, hours and furloughs. And in the toolkit that state leaders have to be able to balance these budgets, they can cut programs, they can raise revenue, they can borrow, and for the foreseeable future, unfortunately, going into this upcoming fiscal year, we as advocates are going to have to be focused on what these deficits mean to programs that we care about. Next slide. I wanted to quickly go over the steps in which a state budget is passed. And again, because of some of the differences between our 4 states, this is very general. This doesn't have dates, and some of these steps may look different in each of this each of the steps may look different in each of the states. But it's important to know that this process has multiple opportunities that we have to be able to advocate. And again, you'll hear more about that from our upcoming speaker. So first, state agencies have to show the governor and the administration of the state what they propose their spending needs will be. After that, legislators typically identify what their budget priorities are, whether it's funding new programs, creating new things, defending new things, creating new revenue. Before a budget is typically presented, legislators are coming up with those priorities. The governor and the administration will typically present an initial budget that legislators and advocates alike will have the opportunity to respond to through formal processes in your state houses. And then there will be opportunities to reevaluate these budget proposals, typically with a keener look on what the state revenues are going to be. States typically track their revenues multiple times a year, and because of this, they have a clearer picture during this process, closer to when passing a budget, what the actual revenues will be. A legislature will then typically vote on a budget, and even though there is the process, the legislature votes on a budget that goes to the governor, many times there are going to be key decision makers in this process who are having negotiations outside of this formal process that will guide this formal process. And so for us, it's important to know who are those key decision makers and how can we influence them? How can we ensure that our priorities become their priorities? And then a governor will sign a budget. Really quick, before introducing our speaker, I would give one crucial piece of advice, and that, in my mind, is to always try to be early in this process. Whatever your state's process is, trying to get out before these things happen, to influence them, to advance our priorities is always going to be important. So for us as an association, as the state agencies like Department of Public Health are determining their priorities, we're trying to communicate with them as they're doing that so that their priorities incorporate the Alzheimer's Association priorities. For legislators, before they come up with their legislative packages, their budget priorities, trying to make sure that we are having good communication with them, that we forge good relationships with them, and that they are incorporating in their priorities our priorities. So whenever we can, being earlier in this process is always key. And so next slide, I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, one of our state champions here in California, Karen Zimmerippa. Her professional career outside of being Alzheimer's state champion prior to her current role was leading the California State University 5 years. In California, we have 3 segments of public higher education. The CSU educates 500,000 individuals, and she led our state advocacy program for the system for over 25 years. She now leads her own consulting firm specializing in higher ed policy. And so I'll thank Karen for joining us and pass it to her.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yes?
I can hear you.
Great. Okay, so we're going to follow some slides that Jared and the team were able to put together for me, just following an outline that I put together. what I want to emphasize is how critical it is and how important we all have as the impact that we can have as volunteers. We really need to be able to create a movement and a sense of voices, both at the state capitol and in local communities, in order to make a difference together. What I'm going to try to do is build a little bit off of the prior Academy sessions that we've had, including those that dealt with telling your story and how to engage your local legislators with events and town halls, but also the very important use of social media. But what is my core message, if nothing else, is that voices of many are going to be heard more than less. I think Jared and the Alzheimer's team does an extraordinary job in the Capitol, and we are grateful that they are there. But really, legislators, when they are dealing with all of the kind of competing demands that you've heard both just at the federal level, let alone also at the state level, there's a lot of noise. And so we really need to find a way to make our voices heard. And that, in my view, is by having as many of us as volunteers active and participating in the process. So when I think about our work, I think about our work as kind of advocacy in the immediate, which I'm going to talk about, and then what I consider to be ongoing. And as Jared's heard me say for some time, I think of those two as kind of indirect and direct advocacy. Next slide. The example that I want to use kind of combines all of those things with something that we did at the CSU that I think is more than replicable in the components that I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes. We did an effort in the budget cycle of 15-16 where CSU was asking for the state to fully fund our budget request. And what that meant was that we were asking the legislature to add an additional $100 million to the governor's proposed budget for the CSU. And what we did was we set about creating the Stand with CSU campaign. There's nothing less than a campaign. It's not a political campaign, but it is a campaign to convince legislators and the governor to approve that request. We had incredible advocates in the form of volunteers with our students and alumni. There is no way that our effort would have been successful without their active voices, both in the Capitol and at the local level. We also use social media, including Twitter and Facebook, and went out of our way to recognize legislators that had supported us. So what did we do? We set about asking legislators to sign a letter that supported a $100 million augmentation to the CSU budget. What we then did is that we had students and alumni support that request. And when a member of the legislature signed that letter, they were visited by local constituents, primarily students, in the Capitol office with a sign that said, "We stand with the CSU," that they could put on their door at the Capitol. We then took pictures of the legislators with their students and with alumni and put that on every social media venue that we could, and became a movement on Twitter and Facebook. And that was all driven by volunteers. We also then went out of our way to recognize legislators. Legislators love to be recognized. I believe they've run for office because they want to be loved, and they would like to be acknowledged as often and as frequently and as in various venues as possible. We finally ended the campaign, if you will, with the creation of socks, Stand with the CSU. And we distributed socks to every member of the legislature and asked them to wear their socks on a given Senate and Assembly floor session day. And it was phenomenal. We got Twitter and Facebook, as well as regular media coverage, both at the Sacramento and in local districts, because people were tweeting pictures of themselves with their socks on. And groups of legislators on the Senate and Assembly floor with their socks on. So we became the Twitter trend for several days as a result of that activity. My point in telling the story is not necessarily to say that we want to perfectly replicate that, because obviously it was a different theme. It reinforces the importance of volunteers in helping make that movement and that campaign real. Next slide. We think of advocacy often as the cigar chewing lobbyist that we've all seen in those caricatures. That's certainly not Jared and the team, but we are in fact professional advocates, and then there are the volunteers that are here to reinforce that team and make sure that our issues are not lost in that big noise and all of the fray that's going on in the Capitol. Our issues and concerns are going to be overshadowed if we are not ever present and always on the mind of our legislators. Next slide. When I think of advocacy, as I said, I think of advocacy that is immediate, proactive, and direct. And usually it's about influencing an immediate outcome. This is usually in response to our team. And I know sometimes it can be frustrating, but we certainly don't control the legislative calendar, and we don't control when the crises or the need for help emerges. So we need to be ready to make a specific ask when we're requested. That might mean that we're asked to call or visit district offices, or even those that can in the Capitol, to send letters, email, and social media, and make those phone calls. Again, it's usually tied to a legislative calendar that Jared doesn't control, so often it might seem last minute, but just do your best and bear with the fact that we don't control that environment. The state budget challenges, as Jared said, are pretty profound, and we are going to be competing with a lot of demands. You've already seen some of the activity associated with other programs and other causes, and so we really need to find ways to not only be there in the immediate ask, but also to find ways to build that connection over long term. So that takes me to the next slide, which is about our ongoing, advancing, or what I would call indirect advocacy. This is really about what you've all been doing, and that's building a relationship. We want to become a trusted resource for our legislators and their staff. We want them to know that they can count on us to help them when they have questions or they need assistance on issues that we are knowledgeable and experienced about. And so we need to find ways to make that connection and make that two-way relationship workable for both of us. You are best equipped to start that process by just telling your story. You, sadly or unfortunately, have stories to tell about our experiences with Alzheimer's, with our family and loved ones. You also have a community that legislators need to learn from, and you can connect them to that, whether it's through attending town halls or forums that they host, that you can raise issues and ask questions, direct meetings, again, social media, and to the extent we can, finding ways to generate local newspaper stories and features about the challenges in our community and the needs of those that are afflicted by this disease. It's also our job to educate and engage them. And so hosting special events for members and staff, reaching out to them and inviting them to events at adult daycare, memory care, and other communities that serve the needs of our particular community, not only with family members, but with residents, and recognizing them for their efforts along the way. In conclusion, and pretty quickly, we can make a difference with our collective voices. It needs to be more than our presence in the Capitol via our professional staff. We need to be the voices at the local level that inspire our legislators and their staff to do the right thing and be responsive to Jared and to all of us when we need their help. We need to partner with our team. We need to take our lead from them. It's very important for us to stay on message and follow their strategy. We also need to be able to quickly respond to their requests for action when they need us. We need to continue on an ongoing basis, day to day, week to week, finding ways to build stronger relationships with our local legislators. And don't forget the staff. They really drive a lot of this ship. But we also want to have a two-way relationship. So we want to become a trusted resource for them. We want to be able to help them as much as we ask them to help us. So think about ways that you can do that. And finally, be ever present. We don't want them to forget that we're there. We don't want them to forget our issues. And we need to find positive and constructive ways to make sure that they are reminded of their challenges that our families and loved ones face and what we can all do together. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So we'll open it up now. We have a few more minutes left in the hour for questions on the state side. And if there are any questions, please feel free to utilize the question feature in the Blue Jeans system. But one question that we already have is whether or not we believe that the state of California anticipates staying on track to passing a balanced budget by June 15th. And I would answer that by saying, one, I don't know. But the reason I say I don't know is I'd say that we're more likely than ever since the passing of the ballot measure that I had spoken about 10 years ago or over 10 years ago. We're more likely now than ever to see something like that. And the reason for that is we've seen our legislative process shrink due to a recess that was called for almost 2 months that has accelerated many of these processes. And now that we're seeing this huge cut be presented now, legislators have a very short amount of time to decide what they have to do. And they're going to, as Karen mentioned, be hearing it from everyone, from all stakeholders, all advocates, all interest groups of why these cuts shouldn't happen. And that's going to put a tremendous I would say I don't know, only because it's hard to say whether or not they will or not. We had been hearing for months that what the state would do is pass what's called a workload budget, similar to what Daniel had been mentioning, that basically holds firm the previous year's funding, but that's not what we're seeing in the May revision of the governor's budget. And so because of that, I think there's a lot of uncertainty left. And again, for us as the Alzheimer's Association, it's up to us to have our voices continue to be heard within this cacophony of voices, so that our priorities are being responded to by the legislature. Again, creating pressure, but also creating uncertainty. Wanted to see if there were any other questions before we ended our academy.
Thanks, Jared. We don't have any additional questions, but we do have several comments going out to Karen. Thank you so much. Great job. We appreciate your presentation and reminder as advocates on how we should be engaging state legislators. So many thanks to Karen, Jared, and Daniel as well, and Courtney.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. And if I could just quickly say before we wrap up that this will be Nicole's last Alzheimer's Academy with us, as she will be going on to maternity leave. So we want to thank Nicole for being our Master of Ceremonies, or our MC for the Alzheimer's Academy, and wish her well on her leave.
Thank you so much, Jared. Much appreciated, and it's been a pleasure. And hope everyone stays safe and takes care. Thanks again.
All right, thank you. Goodbye, everyone.